China remains at the core of US foreign policy debates, and the trajectory of Washington-Beijing relations will define global politics in Trump's second term. The administration faces the complex task of confronting China's expanding global influence while safeguarding economic interests and regional security. From trade and technology competition to the contest over international institutions, US policy is poised to test the limits of economic decoupling and strategic containment. This panel will consider how Trump's team might recalibrate its China policy, balancing confrontation with selective engagement, and what this means for allies, global markets, and the evolving world order. The discussion will examine China's efforts to build an alternative system of influence, the economic and security tools of the US, and the implications for stability in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Moderating our second panel today, we are very fortunate to have Professor Kerry Brown. He's a professor of Chinese studies and the director of the Lao China Institute at KCL. He's an associate of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House and an adjunct at the Australia-New Zealand School of Government in Melbourne. He's also co-editor of the Journal of Current Chinese Affairs, run from the German Institute for Global Affairs in Hamburg. He is currently the chairman of the RSAA, and from 1998 to 2005, he was First Secretary of the British Embassy in Beijing. So as with the previous panel, there'll be time for questions in the second half of the panel. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. Otherwise, I shall hand over to Kerry.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. It's a great honor to be here today. So we're going to be talking about China's geopolitics, economics, and the global order. I have three excellent panelists. So I think we'll take them in the order of Steve Tsang first of all, and then, if it's okay, Dr. Deng, and then Dr. James Char. I think they'll be talking for 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. First of all, Professor Steve Tsang, an old colleague, is the director of the South China Institute. Before taking this up, he was at Nottingham for some years, and before that at St Antony's College, Oxford. He's written a great deal about China, most recently with Olivia Chung, The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, which came out in 2024. Steve, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Kerry. I think the marching order I have was to focus very much on the international order context between China and the United States. In particular, speaking about the Chinese approach to the international order. And that is what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes or so. Obviously, how the Chinese projecting its own approach to international order is closely related to how the Americans deals with it. I think we can start off by simply highlighting that for the Americans, their foreign policy in a sense does have a pivot towards China. They may call it pivot to Asia, but it's China in Asia that really is the core of it. Now, the Chinese under Xi Jinping has a global strategy, something that I would say the Chinese before Xi Jinping did not have. They were much more actually pragmatic in terms of how they were dealing with foreign policy. But Xi Jinping has a vision. Xi Jinping would like to deliver the China dream of national jubilation by 2024 or 2049 or 2050 at the absolute latest. And in this conceptualization of the China dream of national rejuvenation, the really central part is the concept called forging a common destiny for humankind, which is regularly mistranslated deliberately as building a community of shared future. But if you look at the original Chinese text, you really struggle to find how it can be translated into a community with shared future. A common destiny for humankind is something that needs to be forged. And this is the center of what the international order China now would like to build up is about. It is not about creating something entirely new and replacing the existing liberal international order. It is about how China can work within the liberal international order and use support from within the international community to transform the liberal international order into something very, very different. And Xi Jinping calls it the democratization of international relations. His words, democratization of international relations. Now, how does this actually work? It works by this very clear idea that the liberal international order is essentially an international order of the West, by the West, for the West. But the overwhelming majority of people in the world do not live in the democratic West, which constitute a minority in terms of population and also in terms of member states of the United Nations. The overwhelming majority of people lived in the global South. The overwhelming majority of member states at the United Nations belong to the global South. China, Xi Jinping says, is forever a member of the global South, by implication, its natural leader. So China's strategy is pivoted to engaging with and winning the support of the global South, with China offering, on the one hand, development assistance through the Belt and Road Initiative, and also a commitment that China will make the new international order look after the interests of the global South. In particular, reassuring autocrats and autocracies that they have nothing to fear. That is the central tenet of the Global Civilization Initiative, and now reinforced by the newly released Global Governance Initiative, that no country or grouping of countries can have a right to tell others how they should be governed or run. So in return, all that China asks for is for countries in the global South to support China in its claim over Taiwan, and also in support of China's ambitions to democratize the international system, transforming the UN system to pivot from focusing first and foremost on the interests of the democratic West and minority, to focusing on the interests of the majority, the global South, as represented by China, neither of which will cause countries in the global South much in terms of their own national interests. And therefore, it is something that does have a very strong sense of appeal. And this is the kind of international order that Xi Jinping has been pushing very steadily, and it explains why in the last few years we have seen China prioritizing meetings with global South countries rather than with the developed, rich, advanced countries. There is a second part of it, which is about China taking Taiwan. And when that is being done, it will fundamentally change the way how the world sees China's standing in the world. But I won't go into that at the moment. I think my time is up. I'll hand it back to you, Kerry.
So thank you, Steve. That was, as ever, a lucid and a good overview of the big issues, the big geopolitical issues. So now if I can ask for Dr. Gemma Deng. She is formerly a PhD student at King's College London at my institute, and has worked on Britain's relations with China, on Chinese soft power, and of course on Europe and China. So if I can pass over to you, Gemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. It's a real pleasure to join this panel today and to reflect together on the shifting US-China relationship. So the US-China rivalry in the economic realm has probably been the most written about aspect of this relationship lately, from the trade war escalations to the more recent Trump-Xi meeting in Korea. Most observers agreed that this was not a genuine truce, but merely a temporary respite. One Financial Times piece captured this mood with the title, "The Escalation is Here to Stay." and the détente, it argued, was tactical rather than strategic. And we're now at a very different juncture, what the Chinese government calls standing at the brink of changes unseen in 100 years. Before 2019, there was still a sense of illusion and hope that the trade war was temporary and this relation between the two countries might ease again. But sometime during that year, that sentiment shifted, at least within the PRC. Until then, the collective feeling in China had been that it was best to remain on good terms with the US and that China still needed to bide its time. The chokehold on semiconductor chips made the sense of vulnerability visceral, and it was feared that major technology firms such as Huawei and ZTE could enter a downward spiral without access to American technology. And containment of China, almost the sole cross-party consensus in the US, was going to bring the great rejuvenation of the PRC to a halt, and the unstoppable economic miracle that had lasted for 4 decades was about to end. Yet sometime this year, during the second Trump trade war, the mood in China began to shift again. As a confrontation escalated and as Washington surprisingly also turned its pressure on some of its traditional allies, China grew more confident than ever before. Now many believe that China possessed more trump cards than the US, and this is something unimaginable only a year earlier. Scott Bessent remarked that China has made a real mistake by firing shots at rare earth minerals, which had alerted everyone to this danger. But that was not a serious political comment. I mean, this was no secret. Anyone familiar with rare earth supply would have known of China's dominance in REE refinement. And therefore, this scenario was bound to arise sooner or later as the US tightened control over critical items that China needed. On the American side, the rivalry now runs through domestic politics too, where national security frames, economic policy, and industrial strategies such as the CHIPS Act. And under Trump, there's even a renewed vision of re-industrializing to become self-reliant, something China has long prepared for, fully aware of the challenges it would one day face with its distinctive political system. Longtime China watcher Kaiser Kuo wrote a bold piece titled The Great Reckoning recently, describing how the US is now borrowing some of China's methods to protect the liberal market-driven system it once believed unassailable. And that, I think, captures the cognitive dissonance in the West today. The rivalry, as everyone knows and feels, is far more than economic. It is a competition of systems, ideas, cultures, and values, a contest to define who will emerge as the winner of the end of history. The two countries have markedly different economies, one far more service-driven and the other historically manufacturing-heavy, though China is now increasingly transitioning to services, which accounted for 56.7% last year. And they each face distinctive challenges as well. In China, for instance, housing market crisis, demographic shifts, and consumer spending patterns. The economics have been analyzed exhaustively, so I will not dive too into empirical details today. Instead, I have been thinking about what happens if China becomes the largest economy and the undisputed leader in critical technologies, particularly as it is already the global leader in renewable energy, an area that should matter more than the competition. Critics often accuse proponents of engagement of using global issues such as climate change or pandemics as excuses to avoid confronting China. But if or when China surpasses the US in nominal GDP terms, allowing its people to enjoy the same wealth level per capita as the political West, what then? Will Washington engage with China, or will the world be forced to divide into pro-China and pro-West camps for decades to come? Are we too caught in the realist national security narrative to imagine anything beyond it? And is there something larger than this competition itself? And what if this emerging world order is only the beginning? I mean, there will be other rising powers after China, and a fundamental shift in the Western collective psyche is needed to accept the inherently fluctuating nature of power. And these are the questions I've been thinking about. I will stop here, and I'm very curious to hear how the others on the panel see where this rivalry is taking us next. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Gemma. So that sets out some of the complexities of the moment that we're in, about cognitive dissonance and the sort of the other phrase you used, which aroused a great deal of interest. I think it was last used when Xi Jinping met Putin, right, in Moscow. Change is unseen for 100 years. So that was something that a lot of people commented on the time, but I believe he's used that phrase many times before. So finally, thank you very much for that. Finally, Dr. James Char is assistant professor with the China program and deputy coordinator of the Master of Science Asian Studies in Singapore at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Published extensively on China's civil military relations and its military developments, and researches on the nexus between the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, which has been something that people have been greatly interested in lately. So, James, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Just before I start, just a disclaimer, because of my background as a think tanker from a government-linked think tank. So the views expressed here are my own views and my own views only. So today I have prepared a very short PowerPoint to fit in with Charlie's brief to talk about military developments in the US vis-a-vis China for the next 5 minutes. So here are my slides. Okay, it seems that I can't use the slides, Charlie, but in that case, I'll just talk through my points very quickly. So my brief today is a very simple one. I'm supposed to talk about the US security policy towards China in the second Trump administration. So very briefly, I'll talk about what has changed from the previous Biden administration. And I will briefly share with you my observations on the emergent policies under Trump to deal with China, not so much to contain it, but to outcompete Beijing. And of course, this theme that we are now all very familiar with, which is Trump's coalitions of convenience. And lastly, points that were shared earlier by my two esteemed colleagues earlier regarding the very intense competition in different domains, including tech, cyber, and supply chain security. And lastly, I will share with you my projections about what some of us see as an era of indefinite and unpredictable Sino-US rivalry. So really, I think the difference between Biden and Trump 2.0 is that Biden focuses on a lot of alliances, multilateral diplomacy, and perhaps some strategic clarity on Taiwan. Unlike Trump, of course, who prefers bilateral transactional deals, quite a bit of burden sharing and strategic ambiguity, at least where Taiwan is concerned. And overall, we see this focus on geostrategic retrenchment and a focus on the Western Hemisphere, which to us in Asia, of course, is the wrong side of the Pacific. And right now, Trump 2.0 seems to be consolidating US borders and American dominance in his own backyard. A return perhaps to the Monroe Doctrine, with the news these days about what's happening around Venezuela. And we may also think about what Trump is doing as his version of Tao Guang Yang Hui. Okay, so really the wrong side of the Pacific, it's something that most of us had not thought about. Before this year, I think most of us here would have conceptualized uncertainty coming from the other side of the Pacific, not so much in the eastern side. And as regards these changes, there's a lot of deep uncertainty over US posture. And a lot of lingering doubts about the reliability of the US security commitment in Asia. And this is something that our friends in Taiwan, especially after the White House meeting that Trump had with Zelensky, have shared with me. There are deep concerns about US security commitment because of Trump's unpredictable style. That in itself adding to the uncertainties surrounding Sino-US competition. Okay, on the next point about Trump's policy is about outcompeting and not so much containing China. And here he prioritizes what I'll be talking about, which is the military and technological aspects of the competition. So in the last few months, we heard about increased investments promised by Trump in nuclear deterrence and missile defense. Of course, the Golden Dome project comes to mind. And of course, this focus on hypersonics and emerging tech domains, including AI, cyber, and space. And at the same time, we also observe some nascent attempts to deny Beijing its spheres of influence via the Belt and Road Initiative. And just as a matter of fact, just today, there was this C5+1 summit in Washington concerning the 5 Central Asian states with Trump, of course. And new theaters of competition, perhaps in the Arctic as well, with Trump's obsession over Greenland. Now, about the coalitions of convenience, I think the emergent policy principles point to a very transactional, very risk-informed approach. And these alliances or coalitions of convenience are really primarily seen through the lens of US interests. What all of us are familiar with now as America First. And of course, there's a lot of burden sharing, defense expenditure. And this also reduces faith in permanent alliances. Of course, we can now see the example and the direction that NATO is moving towards. Not so clear about what Trump intends to do vis-a-vis China in the South China Sea, apparently. So there was a report on CBS News recently about US plans about a show of force against Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. I think here we may want to put more stress on the word show, because I don't think such an operation will be operationalized, especially in the wake of Trump and Xi's somewhat successful meeting in South Korea, although there were no tangible results. And at the same time, of course, these developments risk bolstering China's image and may lead to long-term risks, clearly, because China has been using the uncertainties that we are seeing from the US, what I refer to as the wrong side of the Pacific, and reinforcing its own position as what Wang Yi would say as China's position as a regional stabilizer. Okay, and lastly, if we look at the examples that Trump has set for us in Malaysia, he was there for a very brief period just to preside over the so-called peace deal between Thailand and Cambodia. And so clearly, the medium-term outlook is clearly very uncertain. And Mr. Trump is clearly more intent on headline-grabbing agreements. Okay, now I'll move on to the next part, which is the tech and cyber competition that Gemma talked about earlier. Okay, clearly the competition is very intense in these new domains and concerns expanded export controls on Chinese tech, with US export bans on Chinese software, electronics, data access. I think it's important for us to note that, apart from activities on the so-called front lines, I think the period of consolidation and the developments on the home front in the US, I think is something that Trump has been quite focused on. And the centrality of technology in their rivalry cannot be stated adequately enough. And clearly, these restrictions aim at limiting the PLA's technological and cyber warfare capabilities. And at the same time, they help to ensure US resilience in defense and in other strategic industries through the current attempts to reshore rare earths, semiconductors, for instance, the new TSMC plant in Arizona, and of course in Big Pharma as well. But obviously, you know, the offshoot will be that Beijing will be pushed to strive even harder to achieve autarky sooner rather than later. And the last point I want to share about is my very brief projections about the immediate and medium-term future. And really, there's a lot of uncertainty, unpredictability in the rivalry. And no doubt, the two big men at their summit in South Korea. But clearly, that was only a temporary truce. And we should not forget that the structural competition is an ongoing one. And if we are to adopt a longer-term outlook, clearly there's an era of indefinite, unpredictable rivalry, because until we can see a clear power emerging to replace the US as the security guarantor for the rest of us around the world, I think there will be a long period of uncertainty and change. And I'll just end with a speech that was made by my former Minister of Defense, Dr. Ng In Heng. He gave this speech sometime in February this year at an event in Germany. And I think he has been often quoted since then about how you mentioned trade and security are two sides of the same coin, and that as trade dependencies shift, security alliances will follow. But more importantly, he shared this observation, and I think most of us can agree with that, which is the US has now willy-nilly, and the image has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. So until we can see a clear power emerging to take up the loose ends that have been left open by the new administration, I think there'll be a lot of uncertainty going forward. And I look forward to your feedback and questions thereafter. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, James. So that's given us from different perspectives. I'll just kick things off. We've got some questions in the comments, but I'd also invite others to ask questions. We've got about half an hour now to kind of discuss this. So I just sort of wanted to ask you, Steve, you talk about the sort of changing global order and some of the big issues, the high-level issues. I mean, I guess so. The one thing that won't happen and can't happen is things just stay as they are, right? I mean, you know, China is not going to want, if you think of, you know, if you were Xi Jinping, would you really kind of be able to live in a world where it was just the sort of same business and the UN was the same, and, you know, kind of you would want something more representative, as Gemma said, of this sort of new situation. It's not just you, it's a lot of other powers too. So I suppose, you know, kind of if you were to think 10, 15 years into the future, what do you think would be a workable solution to this? What do you think the world needs to do to kind of try and manage or deal with this, you know, clash of kind of perspectives? Because the one thing that can't happen is that we crumble into complete conflict. Or do you think that that might happen too?
Okay, two things. First of all, China before Xi Jinping did not take quite so proactive an approach with a clear vision of what it tries to do. It was opportunistic. It actually tried to benefit from the problems of the liberal international order. The liberal international order is in trouble. It doesn't need China to make it into trouble. It is in trouble anyway. There are plenty of people not happy about it. There are reasons for people to be unhappy about, and changing it is very, very difficult. But Xi Jinping is pushing it in a particular direction. And his narrative, his projection of China's ambition does have a lot of attraction and traction in the global south. I think this is something that we have to acknowledge. Then it's a matter of up to what the United States and the Western democracies respond. Most of the rest of your global south countries are not going to be responding. They will side with one or the other, or they will say, we don't really want to get caught in between, but we will go along with whatever works best for us. We are not going to be shaping it. The idea that the United States can simply return to the good old time of the Cold War, when the liberal international order kind of work, is gone. But even in that period when it worked, the United States was on the one hand able to work with its democratic allies and also engage with countries in the global south. That projection of the mythical shining house on the hill idea was having some element of traction. Now, at the moment with the Trump administration, it is actually not Xi Jinping who is more effective in promoting Xi Jinping's vision. It is Donald Trump who is promoting Xi Jinping's vision more effectively, because Donald Trump is undermining the liberal international order. It is undermining everything that the Americans have built up in the post-war era of that shining house on the hill type. That Donald Trump's America, putting America first, is not engaging with the global south. That Donald Trump's administration cutting aid to countries in Asia and Africa are literally killing people in those countries. So at the moment, it is Donald Trump who is doing the kind of work for Xi Jinping in building up the momentums to transform the international order. Question is, how long will Donald Trump stay? And whether Donald Trump will leave a structural change in the United States approach to engaging with the global affairs, whether the post-Trump America will be able to come back and project a very different kind of approach to engage with the global south, to make the global south feel that there is actually something there in the liberal international order that can be changed, with them working with the US and the Western democratic countries to make it into something better for them collectively, with or without China. Preferably with China, but if China does not go along with it, it still happens. But that is a very, very tall order. And there's also the issue of, where do the Western democratic countries stand? Are they working with the Americans? Can they work with the Americans? They can't effectively under the Trump administration 2.0, but the post-Trump situation, can that happen? We don't know. Until we know, China is doing very well. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Steve. And then Gemma, I mean, I was at an event in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, which was about the UN and UN reform. And I think there was a colleague who was from the, I think from Fudan University, and was kind of sort of just really baffled, I think sincerely baffled by why there was so much hostility to China having a bigger role in the world. I mean, he kind of got extremely puzzled by this. Because we were saying that people are anxious, as Steve's just alluded to. You know, there's obviously people who are worried, and what that order looks like. What would be helpful is if you could give some idea of, you know, we hear a lot about what Chinese politicians want. What do you think Chinese people? I know you can't, you know, kind of generalize too much, but what do you think Chinese people want a role for their country? I mean, what are they nationalistic? Are they, you know, sort of really wanting China to be dominant number one, or are there some other sentiments that we might not be hearing at the moment?
Well, I think if China were to be number one, it would certainly be a very different kind of power from the United States, because I think it's it's almost cultural that in in China that I don't feel like people are as interested in affairs of other countries or being sort of making people more like China. It's a sense that I have, through reading, through talking to people from very different walks of life in China, and with students here in the UK as well, Chinese students studying in the UK. They definitely, I mean, do not recognize the China that's kind of being portrayed so much of the time in Western media. I mean, I remember teaching at war studies at King's last year and 2 years ago, and I had students approaching me after the class, asking me, uh, they're talking to me, and they said that, when I'm at home, I'm like a firm critic of the Chinese government and the party. But when I'm here, I feel compelled to defend the country because the way that people think and feel and talk about China is just so far off and so ridiculous. And therefore, I'm almost forced to become this defender of what China is and what Chinese intentions might be, because I certainly don't think I don't think Chinese people want to, become the sort of hegemony in the new world order. I think they just kind of want to get on with their lives. I think Chinese people are hugely pragmatic. They want to travel. They want to, eat great food and just do things that is materialistically comforting, I guess. I think that's what's on most people's mind, and sort of, just getting on with their life. I don't think they're too concerned about sort of making China great again so that everyone else can be more like China.
Great, thank you. And then, James, I mean, well, you're in the region, you're in Singapore. It seems that there's a different approach by the countries around China, but they're the ones that obviously are closest. They feel China's influence every day, and yet they seem to sort of have more pragmatic approaches. I think I saw a survey the other day with some sentiment in the region, which is not as panicked as it may be in Europe or America about China, just sort of, we have to work with this. There's issues, but there's also other places where maybe it can help us. People are skeptical. They know that there's going to be problems in some areas. They're not going to let their guard down, but got to live with it. I mean, what do you think that Europe and America can learn from the region about how to deal with China? Because I think we've got to learn some things from you, because you seem to be doing a bit better at it than we do at the moment.
Thanks for the kind words about Singapore's policies on the US-China rivalry. I think how Singapore has benefited from our decades-long relationship with both Washington and Beijing. It's premised on the fact that we are friends with both sides of the fence, and we try our very best not to take any sides. Of course, we have set a very good example for some countries in the West. I remember being approached by one of the staff at one of the European embassies here. I wouldn't say which one, about how they can learn from Singapore in dealing with China in a friendly manner. I think we do manage this relationship quite steadily, because we have regular meetings. Our deputy prime ministers meet on a very regular basis with our Chinese counterparts. And of course, in the US, we have so many friends in the US Congress that we send our best and brightest to the top universities, for instance, Harvard, Stanford. And if you look at the members in our parliament, many of them do have some experience of living and working in the US in an earlier part of their careers. So I think we try our very best not to take sides, but of course, there's this apparent drift by some of our neighbors in the last few months. For instance, if you look at the example of the military parade on 3rd of September, I was personally quite surprised that the leader of Indonesia actually took a red eye flight amidst the domestic unrest in his country just to be present at the parade. And apparently Mr. Xi did the unprecedented by rescheduling his meetings with all the, I believe, 26 leaders of the different countries, and he pushed the Indonesian leaders' schedule right to the front so that he could return to Indonesia to attend to domestic unrest. And of course, we've seen our neighbor Malaysia as well becoming quite friendly with China. But of course, we shouldn't discount the fact that, amongst us, we try our very best, and same thing applies to Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, when he welcomed Mr. Trump with open arms. And I think the region will continue to face a lot of stress, and the stress can only get bigger with the continued retrenchment of US military power. And it remains to be seen how Singapore and the rest of our neighbors in the region will be able to navigate this safely and with stability. Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. So I suppose to all of you, I've got some sort of questions from the audience, which it would be good if you can maybe sort of change them, answer them maybe in a bundle. So I'll give sort of 3 at a go, and then ask you all to comment on them. The first is really about internal political and economic issues, and social challenges and weaknesses within China. I mean, we talk about China being strong and powerful all the time, but clearly, there's economic problems at the moment, environmental problems, demographic problems, we could list them. Will they really kind of, in the end, put big limits on China's aspirations? So that's the first question, something about the domestic politics. The second, which Steve's already alluded to a bit, which is the kind of issue around Trump. What sort of opportunity is it that he's offering China, or maybe he isn't? So we saw Xi Jinping and Trump meet in South Korea. The 2 leaders are very different leaders. Their psychology, their personalities are so different. But I think what was impressive was the sort of calmness of Xi Jinping dealing with, this very volatile kind of capricious American leader, and the fact that they were very understated afterwards. They didn't sort of make any real big comment about whether this had been a success or a failure. Most people said the show had been won by Trump, but really the game had been won by Xi. So do you think that how do Chinese see Trump? What do they really make of him? And I suppose finally, there's a question that's alluding to the role of Russia. Trump has a very transactional approach, kind of doing deals where he's sort of kind of really trying to make America first, but alienating a lot of his alliances. So there's a question here about, is there a scenario in which a thaw could occur between Beijing and Washington, and the Chinese could replace US without competition just by getting Trump on their side? I mean, it's a far-fetched thing, but kind of, could it almost happen by stealth? And of course, one of the kind of issues that people worry most about, and I think Steve mentioned it, is Taiwan. Would it be that America would really kind of be transactional about even this? So maybe if we start from Gemma, and then James, and then Steve, if we do it in that order. So any questions you want to answer from that list? Gemma.
So the first question on Chinese domestic politics and sort of the problems that China's facing. So I haven't been back in China for 5 years, and I traveled back to China this summer, very briefly. And To my surprise, it felt that it was very lively, and it was summertime. It was very hot, and so people are all out and about. So like sort of tons of new like shops I've never seen, like bubble tea shops and you name it. So I guess the sentiment in China, it's slightly more upbeat and or positive, if I can say, than I had anticipated. Because I mean, my parents are business people in China, and so I do hear about the worries, of how things are getting very tough. So I do experience on the first hand, how the economy it doesn't feel the same, quite as the same as say when China was in its real stride. So I'd say that, it's definitely it's definitely there's a slowing down in the economy, but I think people are generally quite sort of spirited in a way that I did not expect. But I do think there are obviously very sort of difficult challenges that China faces. I mean, look at the declining sort of birth rate, and the government is trying to push sort of narratives or everything that your policies, everything that they can do to encourage people to get married and have children. But I think the young people in China are incredibly stressed out. I mean, I think there's one thing in China that's particularly tough compared to, for example, living in developed countries or Western countries, is that they have this sort of 35-year-old sort of cut off, as if one should just drop dead once they turn 35. And so you feel like you are no longer advance anywhere in your career, once you turn 35. And so there's this sort of immense pressure on younger generation and also on women, because in China they can ask you questions like, for example, are you married? Do you have kids? Do you intend to have kids? And these things are not, to be asked here, for example, in the UK, to have biased outcomes on people's hiring. So I think there are lots of problems in China. And in terms of what people think of Trump, I mean, am I meant to choose one of the? Okay, so to my surprise, I'm very surprised that Donald Trump is actually, I mean, having been one of the presidents that's really given China a lot of grief, is surprisingly very popular. I mean, the first time that, before he got elected, I was very curious why, Chinese people were kind of, just really enjoying this character and sort of giving him nicknames of like 川建国, which is like Trump building China. Or, I always thought that was very funny, but at the same time, as someone who grew up in Britain, who probably takes politics a bit more seriously, I kind of have always thought that was a bit baffling. And, even to this day, I find that people kind of find him a huge source of amusement. I mean, like sometimes I would be getting messages from my parents, about Caroline Leavitt, about her remarks, and sort of, being hugely amused by these things, how the sort of current American administration have become just so random. And I was like, Mum, you do know that the things that she's saying is very un-PC. And my mom's like, yeah, but it's, I mean, look at her go. So it's surprising that I feel like Chinese people are probably like more on the right side of the political spectrum, like more than people would imagine. I mean, people probably imagine China to be somewhere pretty on the left, but I find that, a lot of Chinese people live in the US or UK, they vote Reform or Republican, they're MAGA. So it's, yeah, I think it's surprising. And on the last question, sorry, what was the last question?
Actually, it's okay, because I think I'm gonna. That was really about the transactional issues, which I think maybe James and Steve can cover. But no, that's really helpful insights. It's really important to hear these domestic voices, because I think you're right, Gemma. perception of Chinese views outside the country can sometimes not really align with what you might encounter within it. But yeah, James, maybe about the transactional nature of Mr. Trump, and also specifically, there's a question for you about the alliances with Japan and South Korea. Will Trump's unreliability with these kind of alliances embolden China to push boundaries when it comes to flashpoints like the South China Sea and Taiwan?
Okay, I think I'll answer the question selectively before I talk about whether Trump will be transactional in Taiwan. In fact, I was just there last week, and I can share a bit more about that later. But really, I think I'll link domestic politics with Trump and Xi's meeting in South Korea. Just yesterday, I believe, Mr. Trump talked about how he thought the people sitting next to Xi appeared so scared they did not even dare respond to some of his small talk when they were seated across the table. And I think really Mr. Xi's position compared to Trump is really different, because Mr. Xi clearly is a far-sighted strategic thinker, and really I think where the PLA is concerned, is no surprise that he has set 2035 and 2049 as some of the key dates for the PLA to attain certain goals. So, for instance, if we are referring to the mid-century goal by 2049 or 2050, that really directly links the construction of a world-class military to the party's strategic goals, and that is to build a world-class military so that it can be more helpful in helping the PRC shape the international environment to suit Beijing's preferences. So Mr. Xi clearly has a long-term goal, and most of us would agree that, in the absence of an heir apparent, Mr. Xi should be around by the time of the next party congress in 2027. So that's the first part about domestic politics. And about Taiwan, yes, I believe, as well as mentioned by Steve earlier, I think Trump is doing a lot of work for the Chinese government. And in fact, if we are talking about this very big issue in Taiwan in the last year or so, what they refer to as Yi-Mei-Lun, a question or theory about how reliable the Americans are. I think Trump has done a lot of work to actually answer that question, whether the US would be there, should the Taiwan contingency be for all of us in the region. And well, I can't say for sure whether Mr. Trump will be transactional about Taiwan, but were the US to actually stop advocating for Taiwan sovereignty, I think that would be the worst case scenario, where the PRC actually achieves its goal of national rejuvenation. And that would also mean that Beijing would probably also surpass the US in terms of comprehensive national power, or even developing a world-class military, whether or not they actually engage in an actual firefight in a strait or in those waters of Taiwan. About the question regarding alliances with Japan and South Korea, well, clearly I believe the rest of us in the region, the South Koreans and Japan, we're just very faithfully adhering to the demands to pay our tariffs, to increase our defense budget, and the same goes for South Korea and Japan. Whether that will embolden China to push boundaries, I think, remains to be seen. That again will depend on whether Mr. Trump's discussions with the leaders of South Korea and Japan quite recently is just mere rhetoric, or perhaps he has actually some underlying policies that he's waiting to push out and implement. China, for the time being, because it is simply not ready to challenge the US militarily, I do strongly believe that it may continue to push boundaries in terms of what some of us have referred to as gray zone operations. So really the PLA would stay out of the picture for the most part, and China would continue to try to achieve its natural objectives by sticking to operations below the threshold of war. That's my very brief responses to the questions. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you, James. And then Steve, finally, you have the delightful subject of Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump. Trump said that Xi Jinping was a great leader of a great nation, was extremely fawning to him in some ways. What do you think of this opportunity? Is it an opportunity for China, or is it actually, you know, kind of, it would be a misunderstanding to see America represented by Trump, but it, you know, it's actually obviously much more complicated. What do you think the Chinese real kind of views of Trump's opportunity or not is?
Right. If I may, Kerry, very briefly comment on the other point first. I think the point about China's internal weakness, we have to put a time frame to it. In the long term, the Chinese economic weakness may face a problem, and probably will. But in the short term, the next few years, I don't think it will have much of any impact on China's external posture. We are not looking at the Chinese economy collapsing. We are looking at the Chinese economy slowing. Very, very different things. So I think we should not exaggerate that. On the transactional question, I think we should always bear in mind that there is almost no serious possibility of any American president wanting to be the president who presides the end of American global dominance. And we should not forget that the Truman administration was extremely clear that South Korea was of no strategic importance to the United States in 1950, and it was clearly outside of US global defense parameter until it came under attack. And suddenly everything's changed. And I think those we should bear in mind when we are dealing with that kind of issues, and the Chinese will be well advised to do that. Now, in terms of how the Chinese see Xi Jinping, as Chinese government sees Donald Trump, I think they see Donald Trump as a very dangerous fool. Donald Trump may have done a lot that happens to be beneficial to Xi Jinping's visions and ambition, and they appreciate that. But they also know that Donald Trump is unpredictable to them. And therefore, he can be very dangerous because he will do things that no normal person in the White House would have done. And they constantly have to guard against that. So you get into a situation that the Chinese government know Donald Trump admires Xi Jinping. And therefore, Xi Jinping is China's single most powerful weapons China has for engaging with Donald Trump. And yet, for nearly one whole year of Donald Trump's presidency, China held the Xi Jinping card back. And even when the Xi Jinping card was to be played, they had meetings and meetings and meetings to suss out what the American positions would be before they actually let Xi Jinping talk to Donald Trump, because of the risk that Donald Trump could just unintentionally say something that could embarrass Xi Jinping. So from my perspective, the Chinese government will not go out of its way to try to capitalize the advantages it has over Donald Trump's approach, which can benefit China, because they first think about what is important to China. And here, when the Chinese government say China, it means the Communist Party. Oh, no, sorry. It means the core of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping. So there's a limit to how much they will capitalize on it. But yes, they will take advantage of it when and where they can. And why shouldn't they?
Indeed, why shouldn't they? Good words to end on. So thank you very much, James, Gemma, and Steve. As always, great to talk to you and learn from you. It's been a great honour to discuss these issues this afternoon, and I'm very grateful for the Royal Society of Asian Affairs for arranging this meeting.